Well, hello. It's a great honor for me to talk to the students of Tokyo Metropolitan University as part of the global lecture series. I'm going to talk about the conflict in Ukraine between Russia, not simply between Russia and Ukraine, but more generally, more globally, between Russia and the Western world. I'll try to understand what this is all about, not in military terms, but in cultural terms. I'll try to explain to you, well if I can, what opposes Russia and the West. I'll try to show that contrary to what people in the West think, Russia is not isolated, and I'll try to analyze with the tools of social anthropology the way Russia is in fact connected with a large part of the world. So just a few words about the situation we're in now. We've just got out, or we have to digest two surprises, I would say massive surprises concerning the war in Ukraine. The first surprise is a military surprise. We're having to adjust to the fact that the Russian army is not as powerful as it was thought to be. The Russians have great difficulty in winning the war in Ukraine, and I'd say that the military situation there is moving towards a kind of stalemate. We're not even certain that Russia will be able to take over most of the Donbass region. That's the first surprise, a military surprise. There's a second surprise. I think, in my view, it's even more surprising, and that's about the resilience of the Russian economy. The Russian economy was supposed to be weak, underdeveloped, and vulnerable to Western sanctions. Well, we realize now that it is not. Russia, well, so far, has survived with relative ease the sanctions of the West. The Russian currency, the ruble, is almost back to normal. And so we've got this, I would say, second surprise, that the resilience of Russia, and it's not simply the economy, it's Russian society. The Putin regime was supposed to be threatened by military failure, or at least unsuccess, but it is not. We now have 80% of the Russians supporting the Putin regime, and nothing like destabilization of Russian society is happening. So the most reasonable attitude is to accept the idea that we're on for a rather long war, perhaps a war of attrition between two competing forces, something which promises to be horrible from a human point of view. I mean, many more people will die in Ukraine, mostly Ukrainian, of course, but also Russian soldiers. And this is in itself horrible. But I would say that the one advantage a historian, or even a social anthropologist, can get from such a stalemate or such a protracted war is that we now have time to think. We can get out of emotional attitudes. We can, as I said, we can think and try to understand what opposes Russia and the West. So we must start with the general idea, and this is what I will now try to do. I'll try to be simple, because as I'll be using some concept from social anthropology, some aspects of the talk will be technical, but I'll do what I can. What we must start from is the, I'd say, misconceived notion the Western world has of itself. The view in the Western world, I'm talking from France, but the attitude in France is very much the same as what it is in Britain, what it is in the United States, although it is obviously stronger in the Anglo-American world. And the general attitude of the West, as the core of the Western world, is that the West carries universal values, the values of liberal democracy, of individualism, freedom, and so on, and that it is, in a way, representative of the world as a whole, and that the whole world is, as a consequence, that the whole world is in fact in a coalition against Russia. This is the thing I want to get over. This is what I aim to contradict, and I'll start with a very simple examination of a map. This is map 1, which I have given and which I hope you'll be able to see in a way or another. I'm talking online and things are difficult. It's a map drawn at the beginning of the month of March about the attitude of various countries, the countries of the world. It's a whole world represented on the map, the whole world, and showing various level of condemnation or sanction or acceptance or refusal to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And if we simply focus on the countries that condemned Russia and acted against Russia, either by economic sanctions or by sending weapons, arms to the Ukrainian army, we have to realize that the West, as defined in this way, is very small indeed. Of course, it's dark green on the map. You will see the US, you will see Canada, you will see most of Europe, including, of course, Britain. You will see Australia, New Zealand, and you will see Japan and Korea. Well, all these things said, what you can observe is simply, well, what do you call it? The American system. That's the American system in Europe, and this is called NATO, and the American system in Asia with Japan and Korea as it's the two major allies of the United States. It's something which, if you consider the whole world, is in fact rather narrow and represent a sort of a which is not, and it is not simply, we cannot simply define it in cultural terms, but we must define it in military terms. I mean, Germany and Japan have been under American influence or control since the Second World War, not for cultural reasons, for reasons of cultural affinity or proximity, but because of military conquest in 1944, 1945. So, and of course, there is a narrow, we can see the West in an even more narrow way by fixing our attention on the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American core of the West, which will include, of course, the US, Canada, Australia, Britain. This is, as perceived from a European point of view, this Anglo-Saxon core is extremely visible these days during the war because Britain, as seen from France or Germany or Italy, has invested itself extremely violently in the conflict with Russia. Even American newspapers like the New York Times will emphasize the very aggressive attitude of Britain towards Russia, sending them, of course, the military contribution, the British military contribution to the war is much less than the American contribution to the war, but I would say that the ideological contribution of Britain is something quite important. So there is, in fact, as soon as you look at the map, you do not perceive something like Russia with the whole world in a coalition against it, but rather a conflict, sort of first approach, a conflict between the West with a narrow Anglo-American core against Russia, something which is in a way not universal at all. I will now try to contest the idea that the West, in a sort of a traditional way, is fighting for the universal value of liberal democracy. Well, of course, this was true during the Second World War. There's absolutely no question that the US and Britain, in their fight against Nazism, fought for the universal human value of freedom, of equality of men, and so on, and liberal democracy. But I would say that today, in the notion that the US and Britain somehow represent liberal democracy is completely archaic. Here I'm not polemical. I'm not in a sort of a anti-American or anti-British typical French attitude. I have personal links to the Anglo-American world. I feel a kind of kinship to the Anglo-American world, and I can add that this very day I've just had, through my eldest son, my third British grandchild today. So this world is in a way very close to me, and I love it. So what I'm going to say is not narrow polemics. So to understand the Anglo-American world as it is, to discuss or contest the notion of liberal democracy as represented by the Anglo-American world, we must first establish a distinction between liberal democracy as a set of institutions from liberal democracy as a way of life, something deeper, something more cultural, mental in a way. Well, it's very easy to describe liberal democracy as a set of institutions. You have freedom of vote, elections, a multi-party system. You've got a protection of minorities, representative government. Well, if you only take these elements into account, well, of course, the US still will appear as a liberal democracy. You have elections there, you've got two major political parties, you've got true fights for election, and you've got a protection of sort of minorities. And of course, this applies, I would say, even better to England. But if you think or try to imagine liberal democracy as a way of life, as a mental system where people, citizens are truly considered as equal at the moment when we talk, and equal as a project for the future, it gets more and more difficult to describe the US and even Britain as liberal democracy. What we've witnessed in the last 4 decades, since, say, 1980, since Margaret Thatcher, since Ronald Reagan, is a change in sort of a general outlook of society, what's called neoliberalism in France and elsewhere. And we've been witnessing an enormous increase in economic inequality. It's gone to inequality has gone to heights that would have seemed unbelievable, and that bring us back to the end of the 19th century. And it's not simply that inequality now in these countries have reached a point where it can be measured not simply in terms of income per household or income per working individuals, but it can be perceived in the evolution of demographic rates. So several books, several articles, the whole school of thought, in fact, is analyzing these days the way that's for important groups in American society. There is a decrease in life expectancy. There is a book by Case and Deaton called Death of Despair, which tries to understand why the white Americans between 45 and 59 have experienced in the past 20 years a decrease in their life expectancy. We're witnessing also a sort of a widening gap between the life expectancies of different groups in American society, with a very clear decline in life expectancy for the lower 20% of society. By low, I mean 20% in terms of income. So there is a widening gap, and the future, the present of the future, and the future of American society, and it seemed that British society is on a parallel course to this. It's a bit late, but it's following the same path. It's the what we're witnessing is a deep rise in inequality, which makes it impossible to think about this society as representing, in the full sense of the term, democracy. Liberal, there certainly remain. There's a great deal of freedom in the West, in this Anglo-American core of the West, but there's such a decrease in equality that the word democracy seems archaic or passé, considering that money plays such an important part in the way the political system functions in the US. We're getting quite used to hear the press talking about the Russian oligarchs, the very rich people in Russia. But the truth is that Russian oligarchs have absolutely no power in Russia itself. The state is all powerful in Russia. The Putin regime, the state is power, and oligarchs they're rich, but they are nothing in political terms in Russia. Whereas in the US, oligarchs, very rich people, do have some power to influence elections by providing money to politicians, by financial think tanks and all this. So oligarchs, to me, as a term, would apply to the US in a much better way than to Russia. I wouldn't apply the term plutocracy, that's power of the rich, to America, plutocracy rather than democracy, because it's not only rich people that dominate the new American system. It's something vaster, and the military in the US, with the Pentagon as at its center, represent an important element of power within the American system, and the military, the top commanders in the military are, well, reasonably wealthy people, but they're not rich people, they're not plutocrats. And so I think the better term to describe America right now no longer is liberal democracy, but a liberal oligarchy. That's a liberal system where the minority rules and directs the system. This is not, I'm not accusing, I'm only trying to produce a correct description of what is happening in the politically dominant part of the world. Now, moving from liberal democracy and its disappearance to the adversary, to Russia. How could we describe Russia? In common media parlance, Russia would be described as a dictatorship. China would be described as a totalitarian system. But I think, again, that these descriptions do not fit the situation properly. There is, if you take opinion polls rather than elections, there are elections in Russia, and they are not as rigged as people say they are, but there aren't any election in China, because there the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely dominant with the police. It's also a police state. If you take opinion polls, you will measure something you no longer find in the West, and that's a very high level of approval for the government. I mentioned earlier in this talk the 80% of Russians who approve of Putin's attitude in the present war, and before this, before the war, his approval ratings were something like 60%. In the case of Russia, it's even more difficult to describe the system as a dictatorship or a non-dictatorship, as there used to be elections with a dominant party giving a majority to Putin. So perhaps, considering the favorable opinion polls, the election and the majority the Putin regime finds in election, perhaps Russia should be described as a democracy, but this would be too much. And Russia certainly isn't a liberal democracy, because in the idea of liberal democracy, you've got the notion that minorities must be protected. And this, of course, is something you don't find in Russia, especially in these times of war. There's no protection of minority. So I think at the present stage, this is a kind of provisional description. What I would use the term authoritarian democracy to describe Russia. And if you look, because there's no protection of minorities, because there's an element of conformity, it's majority rule without any protections of minorities. If you look at the way if you compare elections in countries like the US or France, for that matter, and Russia, you will notice that the power system relates differently to the social classes. What you will find in the US is a predominance of an alliance between the real top of society, the very rich, and the upper middle classes, with the rest of the population, for the working class, or what's left of the working class, ordinary people in a situation where they can no longer decide on things, where they are no longer truly represented. And this is what I describe as a liberal oligarchy. Well, if you examine electoral results in a country like Russia, you will see that the way the classes interact politically is different. You have a sort of a bridge between the upper classes, as represented by the top of the state. Russia is a state system, and ordinary people. So there is an interaction, a coalition between ordinary people in the provinces, poor people, average people, and the Putin regime. And it's the upper middle class that in the major urban cities, which will appear as dominated there will be the unprotected minority. So we have here two very different kinds of system. Now we've got to, this is something we've got to explain, this opposition between what I think is the correct perception of the war and the conflict in values on the political level. And that's the conflict between liberal oligarchy on the one hand, that's the West, and authoritarian democracy on the other hand, and that's Russia, the West, or in the sort of extended, perhaps too extended notion, China. Of course, China is difficult because they've got this semi-totalitarian system, and they have no election. But we must, this is a difference we must explain, because we're here confronted with developed nations where people, a large part of the population has gone through some kind of higher education. They're advanced countries. They're very similar, and they ought to be very similar in many ways. And we have a mystery here. We must understand why the US, to simplify things, and Russia have not converged into some kind of model, why they are so different. And to understand this, I will have to go back to my earlier work on the connection between ancient family values, ancient family systems, and the divergence of nations in their modernizing phase. Several decades ago, I came across a fascinating coincidence between the traditional family system of the peasants in the various parts of the world and the types of ideologies that emerge in the modernization process when people started to learn to read and write, when urbanization took place, when secularization, I think the disappearance of active religion started. And there, if we simply, not studying the whole of the world and all the traditional peasant family system in the world, if we simply focus on the Anglo-American world and Russia, we will immediately see a major difference. The traditional family system of English and then American peasants was a nuclear one. It was never, people often imagine that in the past the family was very complex, but it's just not true. If you take England in the 17th century, you will only see in the old nominative listing describing the families, the household of the past, all you will see is a father, a mother, and their children. And where their children wanted to marry, they had to leave their family and start a new nuclear family. So there was a sort of liberal interaction between generations. Soon, very soon in life, children got some kind of autonomy, and in a way, freedom, the freedom of the individual was learned at an early age within the family. To this, in the case of England, was added a great indifference to the notion of equality between the children. What was predominant in England was the possibility of distributing family wealth completely freely by the parents. drawing of wills was a sort of a tradition in England. And so what you find in the traditional peasant family in England, and of course this was translated to America and adopted by immigrants in America, was a family organized by the values of freedom, that's freedom between parents and children, and non-equality between children. And of course, when people started to read and write and sort of translated these family values in ideologies, what happened is, well, a sort of natural emergence of a liberal, non-egalitarian, individualistic ideologies. And there we're talking about the basis of liberalism, liberals and liberal democracy in England and America. At this stage, we can talk of democracy because the fact that all people could read and write established enough of equality to produce a democratic attitude. Now look at what the Russian peasant family system was. The Russian family system was something entirely different. It was, when you look at 19th century early censuses among peasants, what you observe is massive families, the father, his sons, their wives, and the grandchildren, and sort of a compact household. And of course, the values in the this compact households were by no means liberty and non-equality. I would say that the first value established by the relationship between parents and children was a very strong value of authority of the father over his son. But between the sons, what predominated was a very strong value of equality. At the death of the father, the inheritance, or what was considered as inheritance, we're talking of very poor people in time, was very strictly divided between the children. It's the same kind of system could be found in China. In fact, this kind of system could be found in most of the countries that went through communist revolutions in the 20th century, because what happened is that when people started to read and write, when they reached the level of understanding or accepting ideologies, they found the idea of a very strong integration of the individual within a global structure, the reasonable thing. And so, well, communism basically is a totalitarian system that tells you that people must live under the authority of the state in a collectivist economy, and where people are equal. So, of course, Russia got out of communism. The communism collapsed around 1990. But what I'm trying to suggest is that these social, anthropological, family differences are still active in the world today, and they can help us explain why there is so much difference between the values and the political systems of, say, the West. The narrow West would be the Anglo-American world, and not the East, but Russia, Russia to which you can add China. So, of course, communism has collapsed, but the sort of a communitarian attitude has by no means disappeared in Russia and China. And I would say that the egalitarian bias in the system is still there. And this makes it possible for you to understand why Russia and China, although communism has in a way collapsed, or even China has turned into some kind of market economy, why there is so much difference between these post-communist systems and the West. So if you want to understand the deep Russophobia in the Western world, and especially in the US, and even more especially in Britain, in England, I think you must add something. I've been thinking, I'm trying to understand Russophobia as a sort of a technical problem. I find it difficult to understand why the British, or Westerners generally, hate Russia so much. And I think there is a sort of perverted racial element in this. It's because, how to put it, Russians are, well, if you look at Russians physically, they most of the time look like Scandinavian. Many of them are blonde, blue-eyed. They're in a way, they ought to be perfect Europeans, and they don't. They still have different values, different attitudes, a very strong idea of the nation. They're not individualistic, and of course this gives them some strength in their some ability to resist the West. But I think Westerners, individualistic Westerners, are all the more hostile to Russians because they're racially so much like us. They ought to be perfect Europeans. Try to imagine. Try to understand why Westerners are in fact more tolerant of the Chinese truly totalitarian system than to the Russian authoritarian democracy. It's because the Chinese, I think, are still perceived as Asiatic in a way, or we used to be the yellow race and so on. But there's something, and they're different. If you keep some sort of trace, unconscious trace of racial feelings, I'm not like this personally. You will say, well, of course the Chinese are different, but it's not simply a question of values. They've always been different, and we are not supposed. They never were supposed to be like us. But the Russians ought to be like us. They look like us. They're sort of even ideal type of the blonde, blue-eyed European most of the time. It's not always true. There's some mixture of populations in Russia. And this is, I think, what can contribute to explain the very deep Russophobia in the West. They ought to be like us, but they've got this conception of the nation, of a non-individualistic culture with the preference for a strong state. And so they represent something that is truly unacceptable. Now, with the times I've left, I will try to understand and explain with a very important map of the world, that's map 2, why Russia is not isolated and why Russia is even less isolated than it used to be in the days of communism. And to this, I have drawn a sort of general social anthropological map of the world. This is map 2, which describes what social anthropologists call patrilineal system. First, I've said that the type of family systems you had in Russia, where the father and his son produced communistic family, well-integrated family, but the architecture of the system was built around males. Males are all important in terms of inheritance or mental attitude. And on the opposite side, the nuclear family, which only consists on a man, his wife, and his children, was what social anthropologists call this corresponds to what social anthropologists call a bilateral kinship system, a kinship system where the family, kin on the side of the mother and kin on the side of father, have about the same importance. And so where you have, in fact, and you've always had, a higher status for women. And if you draw a general map of patrilineal systems in the world, not simply Russia and China, and a map of patrilineal systems, and also, of course, of bilateral kinship systems, you will have what you can see on my on map 2, the centrality and the mass of patrilineal system. The patrilineal system will not simply consist of Russia and China, but most of India, especially northern India. This doesn't appear too clearly on the map, but northern India will be full red rather than orange on the map. But it's also, this could extend to the Arab world and most of North Africa. And by North Africa, I do not mean the Arab part of North Africa, but also Western Africa and so on. And what you can observe on map 2 is a sort of a central world which used to be organized and still is in a way around the patrilineal principle, and basically, and to try to get things very simple, in a patrilineal system, a patrilineal system will never be individualistic. It will always tend to think of the individual as part of the larger system, and such a world will always resist the individualistic ideology of the West, which is, contrary to that central patrilineal world, organized around the value of course, liberty, even if we're now talking of liberty within an oligarchical system. Well, you'll have liberty, you'll have freedom of the individual, you'll have a very high status of women, you'll have a different system. And this system on the map is peripheral and is by no means universal. What I'm to suggest, I have to apologize for being so quick and perhaps unconvincing in the way I describe things. But I would say that this map of patrilineal and bilateral kinship systems tell you, that gives you, I think, or is a kind of description and a prediction of the real shape of the world today. And what I'm fascinated with as a politologist, or as someone interested in geopolitics, and also as a social anthropologist, is the way in which global geopolitical conflicts, military conflicts, now seem to organize around deep social anthropological values. And of course, so these values will explain why countries like China, India, the Arab world will not accept individualistic Western values, why they will have a tolerant attitude to communitarian and authoritarian and egalitarian values in Russia. I think they can produce I'd say a more realistic description of the world. So if you, well, accepting such a vision, or in my view, must not lead to an idea that the but of course I'm suggesting that the division of the world is much deeper than people think, that there's what we are dealing with is not a conflict between political values that can be modified, that can extend, that can conquer, that can convince. I'm trying to explain that peoples, nations, and are still in a way hostage to traditions. But in my view, this accepting such an objective and deep description of the world should not lead to more conflict, but to acceptance of differences that will not be, in the foreseeable future, be neutralized. So accepting the existence of these differences should lead to the disappearance of some important element of misunderstanding, and to acceptance of the other. And that means acceptance of the other means negotiation, and more ultimately, eventually, some kind of peace and balance in the world. I'll add, I've also given a kind of a map of homophobia in the world, because homophobia and tolerant social attitudes have become sort of part of the conflict between the West and Russia. Russians are reproached with their homophobic attitudes. Of course, the decrease in homophobia has a lot to do with the emancipation of women, which is very advanced in the West, and which is of a very different kind in Russia. It's the sort of bizarre way. The Russian system is a patriarchal system which has retained a rather high status for women. There's a kind of ambivalence there in the Russian system. But I've added a map of homophobia to show that the map of patrilinearity, they're very much alike in a way, as a sort of a more immediate meaning, and can explain cultural conflicts today. But I'd like to end this description of what I perceive that the real structure of the world of globalization with something more common, more usual, and that's perhaps not economic conflicts, but economic interaction. So we live in an age of globalization. People have started to speculate on the end of globalization or a new kind of globalization. And this is where I think my description of the world as a central patrilineal world opposing or so different from the peripheral, individualistic, nuclear family terms, progressive for women, sort of other world becomes even more important because in the past decades, of course, we've lived with these differences, but these differences, the existence of these two worlds explains or it has guided the specialization that took place during the phase of globalization. We've seen the emergence of a very powerful, deep, vital interaction between the central patrilineal world and the peripheral, I'd say bilateral world or feminist world, or call it what you like. And this is, of course, my last map 4, indicates the proportion of the population employed by the secondary sector, by industry. And again, we see the difference. We will see there are differences because Africa has never been developed from in this industrial point of view, but it's clear from the map that the industry nations or working class nations, where you see again, you will see China, Russia, India, Turkey, for that matter. Well, they're all part of the patrilineal world. So it's and people will think that it's as only something to do with the fact that these were poor, backward nations, and that wages are low there, and that these wages were low wages were used by the advanced nations to delocalize, to offshore their production. But it's not that simple. There is a connection with the patrilineal family system, a male family system, and industry. I mean, industry is, there are exceptions, there are sectors where women work in industrial activity, but industry, for most of the history of Homo sapiens, has been a male thing. Men work in factories, men build things, men are fascinated by the transformation of matter. A great majority of engineers, technicians, workers are men. And so it is these countries in the central patrilineal part of the world which have, I'd say, specialized in industrial activities. And of course, it's the peripheral, bilateral, from the point of view of kinship, part of the world which has got out of industry. moved very quickly to tertiary activities. The innovation, technical innovation, is obviously still very much within the US and the Western part of the world. But that Western part of the world has done a great deal for the emancipation of women, but it's destroyed its male working class, and it has in a way become very dependent on the physical production by the central patrilineal part of the world. This is I'm very simple, and I have apologies, but I have to apologize for being so simple. But we have, on the one hand, social anthropology tells us that the world is divided into two parts: patrilineal, central, and bilateral, feminist. And it tells us, on the other hand, that an interaction got into place where the peripheral part has gotten very dependent on production by the central part. And this is very much the unknown before us, because I started the discussion of the conflict in Ukraine as a stalemate, by describing a stalemate, a military stalemate, and an economic stalemate. I started talking about the failure of the Russian army to win in Ukraine. I expressed doubts about the ability of the Russian army to even invade the Donbass. But I also talked about the resilience of the Russian economy. And now, I think we're, after the description in terms of social anthropology and industrial specialization, we get a little closer to a complete understanding of the situation. Of course, we understand, we can understand why the Russian economy, which produces masses of engineers and technicians, has been able, since the first sanctions after the invasion of Crimea, been able to survive, why it has been able to turn not simply into a great exporter of gas and oil, but also into a major cereal exporter of cereals, of metals, of fertilizers. It's just like Russia is a country that produces things, not as many things, as many objects as China, but still is a working class producing nation. And that's the explanation, the basic explanation for its resilience, for its ability to adjust to sanctions. But now we're getting to the ultimate question is I've been talking about the resilience of the Russian economy, but what do we have to say about the resilience of the Western economies? Western economies have gotten very dependent, I was talking about this, are very dependent on Russian export of cereal, gas, metals, and a few other things. And of course, even more of export of things made by China or India, well, the central patrilineal world. And the question is now is, well, it's all very nice to sanction the Russian economy, but perhaps for the deep economic and social anthropological reasons I've just described and tried to explain, well, we're not quite sure that the Western economy is that solid, resilient. We're now in Europe, we're just expecting the counter effect of sanctions, where now we see inflation surging because it's not only gas, but we'll have problems with cereals, with the import of fertilizers. We have problems with production. And of course, in a sort of a less accentuated way, this applies also to the United States. So to me, it's a great mystery what's going to happen. If we're moving into a situation where the war is sort of a double stalemate, a stalemate in military terms, where nobody gets to a decisive victory, and a stalemate in economic terms, what is going to happen? Well, in fact, the military dimension and the economic dimensions in a way converge, because as the war drags on, the ability to build arms and arms weapons that are in a way less and less sophisticated, more and more destructive, less and less smart. It all very much depends on the industrial systems in the two parts of the world to feed the war. And it's not, I've absolutely no idea what's going to happen. I must be very clear about this. But it's not certain to me that the West has the industrial ability to beat Russia at this kind of military industrial game. It's obvious. Of course, the US is getting deeper and deeper into the war, but they've also told us that they must start again production of missiles, and we see the US worrying about their ability to produce more and more weapons, as so many of these weapons taken for their stocks have been used, and of course, if you try to get yourself into an imagined situation where China would decide to help Russia in the production of military goods, of weapons, and so on, it's not at all certain who the Western world or Russia is in a better position to win this war of attrition. Well, I hate war. I'll end my talk with this notion that I hate war, and that negotiation and peace is the most desirable outcome. And perhaps I'll end with these words, hoping that this talk will have helped you to understand this new structure of the world better. But I think, last words, last comments, I would say that it's important. That would be nice if you students would start sometimes looking at the maps I've provided, getting into all the details I haven't talked about. Notice the intermediate position of countries like Germany or Japan, which of course are part of the West, sort of in terms of the alliance system, part of the American system, but that you will find on the maps as semi or mildly patrilineal, with a mildly or reasonably preserved industrial system as intermediate. Please look, examine, muse about, meditate on these maps, because this description of the world in terms of social anthropology, of a deep divide, but also complementarity of the West and the rest, knowing that the rest is central, will be, well, your students, you're young, you still have to go through many years, but I think you'll have to live in such a divided world, and I hope my work will, in a very modest way, help the two parts of the world to accept one another. And I'll end this talk there.